Hi, so last week, Ian Hazakostas, the game director of World of Warcraft, sat down with Law, one of the community managers, and did another live Q&A, which is the sort of thing that Blizzard have been doing. This time it's for patch 7.3, and I've already done a couple of videos on the things they said in terms of generally about 7.3, and also specifically about the Netherlight Crucible. This is the third and final part of the video series on that, which is actually going to tackle stuff that's got nothing to do with 7.3. They spent quite a lot of time talking about other things, and this one is going to focus on what they said about raiding. So, first of all, split raid. So this is something that no one likes, and people sort of keep saying, why don't Blizzard stop it? And the response is basically they can't. So I'll go through what they said. So it says, you know, Ian said the developers don't enjoy it, the players don't enjoy it, and we know that. It's not just the players that member in guilds like myself where there's a strong encouragement to do split raids, but even the ones at the top level who accept it, that they're going to do half a dozen or more split raids, they don't like it either. No one likes it. And whenever I've talked about this in the past, people put various comments about, oh, well, they could do this, they could do that. No, I have never seen anyone suggest anything that would in any small way even stop split raids. The only way you can stop split raids is to have loot drops on a particular boss on a particular difficulty be account wide. So in other words, if you kill, say, Mythic Goroth on one character, then if you kill it on any other characters, those other characters cannot possibly get loot. There'd be loot locked on it. Well, that's not fair because that means that you can't raid on your alts. And that's the only way to stop it. Seriously. I'm absolutely fine if people want to put comments down below on what they think could sort it. I'm doing a separate video going through them and explaining how it wouldn't stop split runs, but it wouldn't stop them. There was one question about someone saying, well, what about sharing loot lockouts across difficulties? So this means on a particular character, let's say you do a boss on Heroic, that you're then locked out on loots for that same boss on Mythic. Well, that's straight away unworkable. You can't do that, can you? So Blizzard's point on this one is, do you know what? There's only so many players in the world. They estimate a couple of thousand players in the world who even do split runs. They only do it for a few weeks. Okay, they may not enjoy it, but it's not affecting the vast majority of players. Even the players it is affecting, it's for a few weeks, and it's sort of their choice to be in a guild that does it anyway. In our guild, for example, we did them for this tier, but it was totally non-compulsory. We don't, in our guild, make it compulsory, but there is an obvious benefit to it. There were enough players in our guild went, yeah, that we want that benefit, and so they chose to do it. So it's entirely our choice, definitely. And if you choose to raid in a top guild, you know that that's part of the choice you're making. So they say, you know, you can overblow the impact of this. It's not ideal, and if they could come up with a good way of stopping it, they would do, and everyone would be pleased at that. Everyone, but there isn't, so there's no point in really going too mad on it. In terms of the world first race, there was a few things talked here. Obviously, I did the video on what Exorcist said about the world first race and the tuning this tier round. There was a fair amount of criticism, and a lot of people, there were a few things people were saying. One key thing was, and it's something I partially agree with, but not in terms of how it's been on this tier, is that there was a time in the past when it would take you weeks or even months for to get the world first on a particular boss. For a start, that's not relevant to today. It was a totally different thing then. Apart from anything else, it took you a lot longer to gear up. Loads longer to gear up. You take Vanilla, for example, on the 40-man raids. There was less loot dropped from each of those bosses than drops now. Except then it was for 40 people. Now it's for 20. So you get more items dropping in a 20-man raid than we did for 40-man raiding. And there's only half the number of players we have to gear up. So gearing up then. We didn't have Titan Forging then. We didn't have dungeons that gave access to the sort of quality of loot that could be better than potentially some stuff in the best raids. You know, the fact that tuning some bosses, you just had to farm gear until you got up to the point where you could push past it. So it was totally different world then. But then if, you know, I said this before, if Blizzard wanted to change the philosophy and say, do you know what, we're going to design a boss towards the end of a raid just as a speed bump, and it's a DPS check boss, and we don't want any guild to get through this in the first couple of weeks. So even the very best guilds are forced to farm gear for a bit. They know they're not killing it then. That would be fine if that was for their philosophy, but it wasn't. And Ian Hazzikostas was very clear about this. He said he agreed with everything Exorcist and Method said in terms of their criticism. Totally agreed with it. He didn't agree with some of their solutions, because Exorcist, I think, were very good when they wrote their post about it. They didn't just criticise, they suggested improvements. Now, that's good. Anyone can criticise. It's easy to criticise, isn't it? But the mark of someone who's offering constructive criticism is they suggest an alternative. So Blizzard said they disagreed with the suggestions there, but they definitely agreed with the problems. And he also went on to say, when asked directly, and I've said this before, he was absolutely brilliant in this Q&A, I think, in tackling some really tough questions and giving some frank answers, even though some of the answers I disagree with myself, but he gave them. And he was asked, how long should it take a world-first guild to clear out that mythic raid? And he unequivocally said about a week and a half. Said about a week and in the second week of the raid is when they should be killing it. Round about a week and a half. And that's unequivocal, that's quite clear. And the fact that that didn't happen again links back to the fact that they got the tuning slightly wrong. Now, I'm going to explain, he did explain why they got the tuning slightly wrong. And I think it's one of those things that you can learn from, and we can have confidence that it won't happen again. Because that's the thing, when people make mistakes, that's one thing. Everyone makes mistakes. What we want to know is those mistakes are not going to be repeated. And I think Blizzard gave me at least some confidence that those mistakes are not going to be repeated. So, the other thing he did say is it's very difficult to tune it for those World First Guild. He cited Heroic Ragnaros. So this is Ragnaros Mark II, the one in Firelands. And he said that took about a week and a half to fall. And he said that the community at large generally agreed that that was a well-tuned boss. But he also pointed out, but it was Paragon that defeated it after a week and a half. No one else got close to it. And he said, let's say Paragon didn't exist at the time. It would have actually taken a lot longer. Would people have considered it a well-tuned boss then? So he did note, and I think we have to have some sympathy for this, it's very difficult to tune the bosses for those World First Guilds, but they do that. He said they do that. He said the first few mythic bosses in a guild, of course not. He's not tuning those for the World First Guilds. They're going to roll right through them. If they try to tune them for those guilds, it's going to stop guilds like myself. Guilds like in my guild, we'd have got nowhere in the first week. As it happens, we got 3 bosses. We should have got a 4th. It was a very low percent wipe, but whatever. We got several bosses. We wouldn't have got any bosses if all the bosses were tuned for Method and Exorcist's style of play. So they don't do that. But they say for the last few bosses, they do tune it for those World First Guilds because they want to distinguish between the very best. They don't want the World First just going to the people who get out the gates quickest, which is generally going to be a North American guild, isn't it, really? Because they get in a day early. So they want to be able to have the top guilds distinguish themselves, which is fair enough. They did mention that, a couple of things that do make it more difficult to tune. They didn't mention the Titan Forging thing, because remember, Titan Forging, no evil will be said of it because it does exactly what Blizzard want to do. They didn't talk about Titan Forging, but just quickly here, because people do ask me about it. And people say, oh, I hope it's not going to be next expansion. Yes, it is, because Titan Forging does exactly what Blizzard wanted to do. It gets us to do old content. The fact that people who do Mythic Tomb of Sargeras, I'm not saying everyone, I don't, but some people still run Emerald Nightmare for the hope of Titan Forge gear, and occasionally they get it. That's what they want Titan Forge to do. That's exactly what they want of that system. Same with running Mythic Plus dungeons. Something Blizzard did, behave yourself, Method did, when they got stuck on Avatar, they just went off for a bit and ran a load of Mythic Plus dungeons to get, in the hope of getting some Titan Forge gear, which they got. So it does exactly what they want it to do. So it's staying. But anyway, that's an aside. They didn't actually talk about that. But he talked about, one thing, a couple of things that make it more difficult is split raids. So we've already talked about split raids. He also said class stacking as well. I would still argue class stacking, there is something Blizzard can do about that. When we talk about class stacking, what we mean in this tier, of course, is rogues. Rogues have always been, as a pure DPS class, they're always going to be strong. You're always going to want rogues. Same as mages and hunters and warlocks. But where rogues really distinguish themselves is in their utility. When we say utility, we mean the ability to ignore mechanics. To soak things that kill anyone else. So they've got their Cloak of Shadows on a fairly long... I think about it as a paladin. Their Cloak of Shadows for the vast majority of raid mechanics is just as good as my Divine Shield, only it's on a much shorter cooldown. They get Feint, which is very powerful. Again, baseline ability. They get then a choice, tier choice. They can either make their Feint more powerful for like direct damage against them. They can have Leeching Poison so that they can heal themselves as they do damage. And because they can do quite a lot of damage, that's quite a lot of healing. Or they can have a Cheat Death. Now, one thing that's been touted, I think this is sort of rumoured to possibly be coming, but don't quote me on that, is, and this could potentially sort the class stacking out for rogues, is let's imagine they didn't have Cloak of Shadows or Feint as baseline. Let's imagine they had a talent row. And in that talent row, you had a choice of Cheat Death, Cloak of Shadows, or Feint. Even the improved Feint could have the direct damage as well, so they can have that. But they choose one of those three. The Leeching Poison can be somewhere else. We don't have to get rid of it. That could just be on another talent row. Now imagine they had to choose between Feint, Cheat Death, or Cloak of Shadows. That would still give them really good defensive options to deal with some mechanics, but it wouldn't allow them to deal with, you know, everything the way they do now. That would prevent, to a certain degree, you'd still want rogues, of course. Even from their damage point of view, you always want rogues. But you would still want rogues even for that, because that still allows them to deal with mechanics, but just not to the godlike way they can now. So that's an easy fix. The next thing that they talked about was the reason why some of the bosses were so overtuned to begin with is actually a lack of confidence in their own testing team. Now, I had some comments, erroneous comments, which I tried to tackle. I'll tackle again here on that video from Exhausted. People say, well, Blizzard don't have, like, you know, a whole team of testers. Like, yes, they do. They have a dedicated professional team of raid testers. And then someone else was saying, well, they're not of, like, methods quality. It's like, yes, they are. You know, Blizzard is a big company. They can attract a lot of talent. If they're going to put together a raid team for testing purposes, internal testing, they can get good players. And they do get good players. And these players have got experience of going for world firsts. But Ian Hazacostas did have to confess that even he underestimated them. And when they were sort of... He also assumed that Method would be better than them. And, you know, so they were testing the boss and they were defeating the boss. And he sort of laughed about this. But it was sort of semi-true. And he sort of said, well, if they can kill it that easily, it must be too easy. We'll tune it a bit harder. And then, of course, it was overtuned. So he sort of said, well, maybe we should give more credit to our internal testing team. They are actually really good. And, you know. So, again, that's something else that's relatively easily fixed. Now, there was another thing with Tomb of Sargeras which has caused some consternation. And it's really been more of a meme. Which is Tomb of Sargeras, that on Mythic mode, 8 out of the 9 bosses have soak mechanics. So let's go through them. So on Goroth, you've got the Brimstone to soak, which isn't there on Heroic or Normal, but it's there on Mythic. Demonic Inquisition is the only one that doesn't. Although in our guild, we tend to soak an awful lot of quills, but we're not supposed to. There's, what's next? Harjatan. So you've got the Unchecked Rage, is it? The one that you have to soak? One of them anyway. There's a soaky thing there, cone in front of the boss, where the tanks turn it to the raid. I always forget the names of abilities. You've got Mistress of Scenes. You've got the Hydra shot there. You've got who's next? Sisters. So you've got the I've forgotten the name of it. Big line on it that you get when you have to stack in the middle. Put it through the raid. You've got Desolate Host, where you've got the 2 abilities sort of at the end of the fight in particular that you have to deal with. You've got Avatar, which is the Touch of Sargeras. You've got Kil'jaeden. You've got your Armageddons, which I'm told is on the LFR version as well. What? But yeah, anyway, you've got soaking mechanics on 8 out of the 9 bosses there. So, how did this arise? Now, what Ian Hazacostas said, which gave me some dismay at first, but also it's an easy fix. He said, so what happens is the teams... You know, they have a talk at the beginning, they sort of do a rough design of the bosses, and then the teams split up. The teams working on each sort of boss split up. And what will happen is they'll be doing their testing and stuff like that, and then they'll discover that there's something not quite right about the fight. It might be something about the flow of the fight. Maybe there's an extended period of time where everyone's just tunneling the boss and it's a bit boring. So they want to introduce a new mechanic. Or it might be that a particular mechanic is a bit problem, so either it's too difficult or too easy or whatever. So they want to put something in. And he says that it just so happens that independently, several of those teams all came up with a soak mechanic in order to alleviate a problem with the design of the boss. Now, you can sort of look at it on one level and go, oh, fair enough, it's just coincidence then. But you look at it another level and think, well, that shows you that there was no one whose job it was on a day-to-day basis to be up to date with where all of those design teams are. Now, there should be, if there was someone who was coordinating between all those, just one person who, just on a day-to-day basis, goes around all those teams, finds out what the current state of play is, that one person would have an overall view of the thing and be going, you've got soak mechanics in all these bosses. That's going to be a bit weird, isn't it? And again, lend too much strength to the classes who are really good at dealing with those mechanics. I also forgot, of course, on Desolate Host, you've got the spear to soak as well. Which, by the way, rogues are also much better at than everyone. Rogues and hunters get to soak it properly, and even me in my bubble can only survive it, but not actually properly soak it. Thanks very much. Sorry, I'll stop now. So that didn't happen, because all you then, it doesn't even need to be a manager. I've said this before, it doesn't need to be a manager. It doesn't need to be someone who says, no, you use a different ability. Just someone with an overall view who can then report to a manager who goes, look, you know, this is what it's looking like at the moment. It's going to be a bit silly. And then that manager can go, well, let's get everyone back together, talk about it again. Can anyone think of anything else that would work for their bosses? And see if you can sort of reduce those sort of common abilities. Because, you know, when we got to the point we're at now with raids, it's very difficult to come up with genuinely new mechanics. I mean, we had the fog on Kill Jaden. That's a new mechanic, really. But it's very difficult to come up with new ones. So, you know, when experienced raiders look at a boss, even though the boss might look interesting and new, you break it down and it's like, oh, well, that's a comet ability, that's a thingy soaky ability, that splits damage, but that doesn't split damage, so we need everyone else to move out of it. You know, there's all these different abilities, you know, boss cleaves and stuff like that, that you see time and time again. And Blizzard are pretty good at putting into a new bosses in innovative ways, but it's still the same old mechanics, and it's going to be the same old solutions. So, yeah, you know, so it's disappointing that it's not obvious that you should have someone who has an up-to-date understanding of what's going on in these teams. It belies a lack of coordination within the different teams, but at the same time, that's surely an easy fix. You just appoint someone to say, look, you know, someone just make sure you know what everyone's doing. And report to me as necessary. So what they said was that they were happy. Each individual fight in isolation they were quite happy with, tuning aside for the the later ones. But yeah, it was just the overall package was perhaps not as it should have been. And then finally they had a little talk about raid finder difficulty, and what they've said was, because it's been noted, I mean, I'm a bit surprised at what they've done with Kill Jaden, but in terms of the other ones, obviously it's already been noted that Desolate Host, for example, on LFR, doesn't have the Desolate Host boss. Avatar doesn't have Maiden, stuff like that. So what they've said, and I agree with this, is keeping all of the mechanics in Raid Finder but just making them much weaker doesn't feel good. It says there's a lot of mechanics in Raid Finder you can ignore, which has to be the way. I mean, you know what it's like in LFR. You get people, and people die to stuff, and everyone's moaning at them and shouting out why you're dying to that. And it's like, the people who are moaning about it have probably got add-ons and weak-ors and stuff telling them about stuff. Most of the people for whom LFR is intended don't have that stuff. You know, they don't have that. They've not done the fights. They don't know about it. And they shouldn't have to read it up in the journal either. I know it's there, but LFR's not for that. If you're the sort of person who's going to prepare for a boss fight on a raid, LFR's not for you. Okay, normal, heroic, or mythic are for you. So yeah, what they've said is that, you know, there has to be mechanics you can ignore. So what they would prefer is that each boss had a mechanic that you had to get right. So it's like Shattering Star, for example, on Goroth, they gave us an example. So this is one where you get an arrow on you. You have to run behind a pillar to soak it. He says, you know, if you don't do that, you just stay there, you are going to die. That's how it's intended. So, and that's fair enough, I think. So, yeah, so what he said is they wanted one impactful mechanic on each boss. So that's why certain mechanics are just left out completely. Although I do gather that although some again have been removed from Kill Jaden, if there was one you were going to remove, I would have thought it'd be Armageddon. Apparently they haven't, and apparently that does cause wipes on LFR. So I'm going to have fun with that on Saturday, but we'll see. He also said there's no long... See, LFR has changed philosophy quite a lot over the years. It came in the last tier of Cataclysm, Dragon Soul. So I came back to the game just in time for LFR. And that was a pretty miserable experience, I have to say, from my point of view. I didn't enjoy that at all. But I think it did get better, and then it sort of got worse, and then better again, and worse. They did say they liked the MOP model. I'm not sure about that. I think it's been right in Legion, even though I haven't done a lot of LFR in Legion, but that's just the nature of LFR, nothing to do with the way they've done it this tier, or expansion. I think it is right. But they've said there's no longer a desire to make it tourist mode. I'm not quite sure what they mean about that, because what I would understand by tourist mode is how LFR is in Legion. Because when I have done LFR in Legion, there are very, very few wipes. I don't know whether I've just been lucky because I've done it so few times, but I have experienced very, very few wipes. And I have never experienced persistent wipes. When I have experienced a wipe in LFR, it's been a kill the following pull. I've never been in a situation, which has been the case in the past, where we've done a boss, wiped on it, done it again, wiped on it, load of people leave, new people come in, done it again, wiped on it. That has never happened to me in Legion LFR. And I cannot say that about other expansions LFRs. So it does seem to me to be tourist mode. And I'm not opposed to that either. But they do say there is no longer a desire to make Raid Finder a tourist mode. That's quite strange. And as I say, and I don't know what they meant because they didn't elaborate on it. It was more like MOP than WOD LFR. Because I'm not sure what the key difference between those was in terms of what they're getting at. But my thoughts were that the WOD ones were a lot simpler. But there were still some bosses you could wipe on repeatedly. Whereas MOP ones, mind you, there were quite a lot of bosses you could wipe on repeatedly. You know, I remember Nazgrim in MOP, you could get to that and think, ugh. Whereas I think in WOD, if you were going to wipe on any bosses, it tended to be the last bosses of the raid, like Blackhand or something like that. Or Archimond. I don't really remember wiping a lot to the other bosses. But yeah, in MOP, I mean, yeah, Nazgrim stands out in my nightmares. Whenever I got to that on LFR, it was always like, oh, how's this going to go? Usually not well. Usually not at all well. So anyway, that's what they had to say about raiding. Just to keep you up to date. So that's the last video I intend to do on what Blizzard said this particular time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.